Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, we expect a level of, precision. Like you break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line across the bone, and the doctor just points to the film.
Right.
It's binary. The damage is there. The treatment is obvious.
Yeah, the physical evidence gives us a lot of comfort, I think. We desperately want all of our ailments to just be visible, measurable under a bright fluorescent light.
Exactly. But then you step out of the orthopedic clinic and into the world of human behavior, psychology, neurodevelopment, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just entirely useless.
Completely useless.
Yeah. We end up navigating this diagnostic landscape that is just profoundly murky. And that is especially true when we consult today's source material.
No, absolutely.
We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating recorded dialogue between a clinical psychologist and a neuroscientist, specifically Dr. Justin Nbomb. And they are tackling what might be the single most complicated question in all of science.
Which is, what makes you you?
Right. What makes you, you.
Yeah.
And while the neurobiology is, incredibly dense, our goal today is to break it down. We want to translate these mechanisms so simply that literally a 5-year-old could grasp it.
Yeah, because peeling back the layers of DNA and brain wiring, it requires us to look past our natural biases,
Yeah.
We have to confront this massive contradiction in how society currently views human behavior.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because
Yeah.
our sources highlight a huge double standard between psychology and neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
Think about how we discuss things like ADHD or autism or schizophrenia. The public, doctors, teachers, everyone has entirely accepted that there's a biological reality there.
Right. They understand it's a matter of neurodevelopmental wiring.
Exactly. Nobody looks at a kid struggling with severe ADHD and assumes, well, their mother just didn't love them enough.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
The consensus embraces the biology.
Right. Yet the moment we shift the conversation away from learning differences and toward personality traits, especially negative ones like narcissism or extreme callousness, the script just completely flips.
It's a total 180.
We abandon biology entirely. When someone acts incredibly entitled, the immediate reflex is to blame their parents. Right?
Yeah.
Or point to some hidden childhood trauma. Why is it that when someone has a learning difference, we look at biology, but when someone acts callous, we instantly demand an environmental scapegoat?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the history of science itself actually explains this divide perfectly.
Oh, really? How so?
Yeah, so we have to look at how we gradually became comfortable with genetics in the first place. In the 19th century, genetics basically started with a European monk crossing pea plants.
Oh, Gregor Mendel, right.
Exactly. And he observed traits that were entirely binary, like it's a green pea or a yellow pea, smooth skin or wrinkled skin. The cause and effect were immediate, and you could just see it with the naked eye.
So we started with literally the absolute simplest biological mechanism.
Right. And from peas, science moved to fruit flies and eventually mice. But when we finally started mapping human genetics, we were still looking for the easy stuff.
The visible stuff.
Exactly. We accepted that DNA dictates hair color or eye color. Then, as our tools got better, we accepted that genetics influence height. And eventually, we climbed high enough on that complexity ladder to accept things like ADHD.
We only accepted the biology when we had the tools to clearly measure it.
You hit the nail on the head, and personality sits at the absolute pinnacle of that complexity ladder. It is arguably the single most complex trait in the known universe.
Wow.
Because personality involves the real-time interaction of an intricately wired human brain processing a totally chaotic external world.
Yeah.
We can't easily see how an invisible sequence of DNA base pairs translates into something abstract, like a sense of humor, or a narcissistic defense mechanism.
All right, you can't put a sense of humor under a microscope.
Exactly. And because social sciences can't visually map that, they often just push biology aside. They assume if it's too complicated to be physical, it must just be environmental.
But just because something is too complex to easily understand, that doesn't make it magic.
No, not at all.
Like, consider a smartphone. Very few people can tell you the exact physics of how swiping a piece of glass in New York instantly beams a high-def video to Tokyo.
I certainly can't.
Right. We don't fully understand the engineering, but we never doubt that it's operating on physics and circuitry.
That's a great point.
Human personality is no different. It operates on biological circuitry. even if the blueprint is staggeringly complex.
Yeah, and translating that blueprint requires us to look at how genetics actually build human traits. There are two primary categories. The first is single gene or monogenic traits. You can picture this as a simple light switch in a room.
The power is either on or off.
Exactly. Cystic fibrosis operates exactly like this. If you inherit the specific broken gene for this condition, the switch flips. You will develop the disease.
It's 100%.
100%. No amount of environmental intervention, no diet, no parenting style can stop it. It's an absolute certainty dictated by one single genetic variable.
Okay, let me try a baking analogy here. So a monogenic trait is like a recipe that absolutely requires one specific secret ingredient. Say, baking powder. If you leave it out, the cake fails every time.
Right.
It doesn't matter what temperature the oven is or what pan you use, it's a binary failure.
That's a perfect way to describe it, but very few things in human biology are a simple binary switch. Personality and most of our traits are what we call polygenic, the prefix poly meaning many.
So we're moving from a single light switch to like a massive control board.
A massive board with thousands of tiny, incredibly subtle switches. Think about human height. Scientists haven't found one single tall gene. There are over 1,000 distinct genes that each have a tiny fractional influence on your skeleton.
So adding all those thousands of switches together is what determines your height.
Exactly. And personality operates on that exact same polygenic architecture.
Okay, so if personality is made of thousands of microscopic switches, how do we explain how that control board interacts with the outside world to a 5-year-old?
Right, the 5-year-old test. Well, the source material uses this brilliant analogy about running speed that clarifies this nature versus nurture thing. Let's look at the Olympic sprinter Usain Bolt.
Okay.
Genetics do not guarantee a fixed outcome for a polygenic trait. Instead, genetics give you a distinct range of possibilities.
For range.
Yeah, visualize it as having a hard biological floor and a hard biological ceiling. So my genetic code gave me a specific range for how fast I can run.
Right.
The environment I'm in determines where I land inside that range. If my environment is sitting on a couch eating fast food all day,
You're hitting that biological floor.
I hit the floor. I become the absolute slowest possible version of myself.
But if you change the environment, introduce rigorous training, hire the best coaches.
Right. Optimize my nutrition, train relentlessly, then I slide all the way up to my absolute biological ceiling. I'll become incredibly fast. But here is the crucial limitation of the environment. No matter how perfect my training is, I will never, ever beat Usain Bolt in a foot race.
Because his biological ceiling is just in a completely different stratosphere than yours.
Exactly. He won the genetic lottery for fast twitch muscle fibers, and then he combined that with a punishing environmental work ethic.
Okay, so applying this range to personality, your genetics give you a hardwired range for traits like empathy or resilience or narcissism.
Yes.
So a child could be born with a genetic range that makes them incredibly resistant to narcissism. Strong empathy is deeply hardwired into their biological floor.
Right.
That kid might go through a truly horrific, traumatic childhood, and because of those terrible conditions, they slide to the bottom of their personal resilience range.
Yeah.
But because their biological floor for empathy is so uniquely high to begin with, they still come out of that trauma as a relatively well-adjusted adult.
Exactly. Now compare that to a second child. They experienced the exact same trauma, but they were born with a genetic susceptibility to narcissism. A completely different range of possibilities.
Oh, wow.
Put that second child in the exact same household, and their specific biology dictates a totally different reaction. They might develop full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. Genetics establish the menu of possible outcomes, and the environment just selects which meal is served.
Man, genetics established the menu. That leads us right into this fascinating kind of deceptive loop.
Yeah.
If genetics set the menu, how do we end up picking our meals?
Right.
The source material dives deep into this illusion of the pure environment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, psychology historically treats the environment as an independent variable, something that just happens to us passively, like rain falling on our heads.
Like it's neutral.
Right. But a purely independent environment rarely exists because of gene-environment interaction. When researchers think they're measuring an environment's impact on a person, they're usually just measuring an environment that was actively selected by that person's genetics.
Okay, let's ground that. The reading uses a theme park example, right?
Right.
Roller coasters.
Yes, the roller coaster analogy is great. So, say I want to study thrill-seeking behavior. I go to a massive roller coaster and swab the cheeks of everyone happily waiting in line.
Okay.
Then I go over to the benches and swab the cheeks of the people holding the bags, the ones who are terrified and refuse to ride. The biological data would show a stark genetic difference between those two groups.
Wow. Really?
Yeah. Some people have DNA that makes their nervous system interpret a massive drop as exhilarating. Others have DNA that forces their brain to interpret that exact same physical sensation as a mortal threat.
So if I'm a researcher who ignores the biology, I might look at the data and say, well, people who ride roller coasters are more likely to have thrill-seeking personalities. Therefore, the coaster caused the personality.
Exactly. You completely reverse the cause and effect. You'd assume the theme park created the personality, ignoring the fact that their hardwired DNA is what drove them to the theme park in the first place.
People self-select environments that cater to their biology.
Yes. Our sources highlight an incredible medical parallel to illustrate this, using sickle cell anemia.
Oh, right, the gym class example.
Yeah. Imagine an observer who knows absolutely nothing about cellular biology. They're just watching a group of kids who carry the sickle cell trait. This observer notices these kids sit on the sidelines during gym class, they avoid running, and they also suffer from serious health complications.
So an observer who only looks at environment connects those dots and says, the lack of physical activity is making these kids sick. The environment of sitting out is the villain.
It makes logical sense on the surface, right? But a doctor looking under the hood understands the genetic reality. The sickle cell mutation alters the shape of red blood cells. Heavy exercise deprives those cells of oxygen, causing them to physically block blood vessels, which is incredibly painful and dangerous.
So the underlying genetic mutation creates the environment. The biology makes exercise dangerous, which dictates the environmental outcome of sitting on the sidelines.
Exactly. Failing to understand the biology guarantees you will misunderstand the cause and effect. But humans crave easy narratives. We desperately want to point at a negative outcome and find an environmental villain we can blame.
They really do. And this inherent desire to make up neat, tidy stories brings us to a major pitfall in modern psychology.
It's a huge issue.
To illustrate how dangerous these fabricated narratives are, the source text analyzes a specific psychological assessment of a very prominent public figure, Donald Trump.
Right.
Now, before we dive into this, we need to establish a very strict boundary for this analysis.
Absolutely. This discussion contains zero political endorsement or critique. We are entirely disregarding the politics of the individual.
Completely. We are strictly examining the scientific methodology used by a specific medical doctor in a video clip referenced in our sources. We're just looking at how this clinician attempts to explain human behavior. So in this clip, a prominent physician makes a sweeping claim about Trump's behaviors, specifically traits like grandiosity and public aggression. And the doctor diagnoses these as 100% unconscious trauma responses from being raised by a harsh father.
Yeah, the clinician literally states he had no choice in developing this personality. He frames it as a pure defensive reaction to a toxic childhood.
And honestly, my initial reaction was, well, that's a really compelling story. It neatly wraps up this complex profile into an easily understandable box. So why does the neuroscientist in our reading consider this so scientifically offensive?
Because compelling stories do not equate to rigorous science. The neuroscientist points out that this clinician has presented an untestable hypothesis. In science, there's a concept known as being not even wrong.
Not even wrong, meaning a theory so disconnected from data that you can't even design an experiment to disprove it.
Right. Imagine playing a board game with a kid, and every time you maneuver into a winning position, the kid invents a new invisible rule to save their pieces.
Oh, I played that game.
Right. You can never technically defeat them because they keep altering the fabric of the game to suit their narrative. That's an untestable hypothesis. The clinician in this video has no hard data. He wasn't in the childhood home. He's making staggeringly complex claims about a stranger's neurological development based on curated secondhand observations.
It's fortune-telling.
It is fortune-telling disguised as clinical diagnosis.
And the source material points out a massive logical flaw in his environmental theory, because the subject's brother was raised in the exact same household.
Yes.
With the exact same father in that exact same toxic environment. Yet the brother had a wildly different psychological outcome. He ultimately battled severe alcoholism.
Right.
So the clinician's narrative demands that we believe the exact same environmental trauma perfectly engineered two completely contrasting personality disorders.
And claiming the environment is the sole mechanism just falls apart there.
Yeah.
If the environment is the overriding cause, it should produce consistent outcomes. This failure highlights a broader trend that the neuroscientist calls anecdote-based medicine.
Anecdote-based medicine, as opposed to evidence-based medicine.
That's exactly. It happens when a clinician elevates their own personal assumptions above biological data. They observe a behavior, they uncover a story about a harsh parent, and they confidently declare causation. They entirely dismiss genetics.
Because what if the grandiosity and aggression weren't caused by the trauma of the father's actions, but were just polygenic traits inherited from the father's DNA?
Right. The father's genetics created the father's harsh behavior, and those exact same genetics were passed down, creating the son's behavior. The DNA is the common denominator, not the trauma.
But mapping complex genetics is hard. Pointing a finger at a harsh father is incredibly easy, so psychologists naturally gravitate toward the path of least resistance.
They do.
But, a listener might push back here. Many brilliant, highly educated experts completely support these trauma narratives. There is a massive consensus in modern psychology that environment shapes personality. So doesn't consensus mean something?
Well, consensus is frequently the enemy of scientific truth. Oh, yeah. The history of medicine is littered with the catastrophic blunders of consensus. Just because a room full of brilliant people agree on a theory doesn't magically make it biologically real. The neuroscientist gives some mind-bending examples where the consensus was entirely backward.
Oh, the smoking example.
Yeah.
That one is staggering.
It is.
There was a time before we understood DNA mutation when a consensus of intelligent medical doctors firmly believed that cancer actually caused smoking.
It sounds absurd now, right? But they constructed a narrative that made logical sense based purely on environmental observation. They noted that undiagnosed cancer places immense stress on the body.
Okay.
And they observed that smoking a cigarette temporarily relieves stress. So they concluded that the hidden cancer forces a person to crave cigarettes to alleviate the discomfort.
Their logic was totally sound,
Yeah.
but their biological mechanism was 100% inverted.
Exactly. Or think about the physicians in the 1800s who violently rejected the idea of washing their hands between surgeries.
Oh, right.
The consensus was that gentlemen did not have dirty hands, and because they couldn't see microscopic bacteria with their bare eyes, they arrogantly assumed pathogens didn't exist. They literally labeled hand-washing advocates as practitioners of witchcraft.
They rejected invisible biology in favor of their visible narrative.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source material drives this danger home with this incredible study about placebo knee surgeries.
Oh, this study perfectly dismantles the idea that clinical observation alone proves a treatment works.
Yeah, so a highly respected orthopedic surgeon was doing this very common consensus-approved surgery for knee arthritis. He'd make an incision and physically scrape out the arthritic tissue to relieve pain.
And everyone agreed this was highly effective. Patients felt better.
Right. But he decides to introduce a control group. He conducts a trial where half the patients get fake surgeries.
Surgical placebos to test the actual physical mechanism.
Right. So for the placebo group, they administer anesthesia, they make a tiny superficial nick in the skin, and then they literally just hang out in the operating room for 20 minutes.
They do absolutely nothing to the joint.
Nothing. They just stitch up the skin nick and wake the patient up. And the results completely shattered the medical consensus.
What happened?
The patients who got the fake surgery reported the exact same level of pain relief as the patients who actually had their joints scraped.
Because the pain vanished not from physical alteration, but because the psychological expectation of healing triggered a biological response. The brain's belief that the knee was fixed caused a massive release of endogenous opioids and dopamine, chemically killing the pain.
So doctors had spent years observing a positive result, attributing it to their surgical skill, completely blind to the chemical mechanism doing the heavy lifting. The anecdote of "I operated and they felt better" was totally useless without the biology.
And translating that to psychology, just because a therapist spends years exploring a patient's childhood and the patient eventually feels better, it does not scientifically prove the trauma was the root cause of the behavior.
Okay, I want to introduce some heavy pushback here.
Bring it on.
Psychology has developed some very scientific-sounding concepts to defend the environment. Let's talk about epigenetics and neuroplasticity. Doesn't modern science prove that our environment can literally reach into our DNA and turn genes on and off? And doesn't neuroplasticity prove the brain is basically wet clay, totally moldable by our experiences?
Those are the two biggest arguments used against geneticists. And look, epigenetics and neuroplasticity are absolutely real, documented biological processes.
Right.
But in popular psychology, they are wildly, dramatically oversimplified to support this idea that environment controls everything. We have to clarify their actual limits.
Let's start with epigenetics.
Yeah.
Explain the mechanism to me like I'm 5. How does the environment interact with DNA?
Okay. Picture your genetic code as a massive, ancient library filled with millions of hardwired instruction manuals.
Okay, a library.
Epigenetics operates like a librarian walking through the aisles, placing sticky notes on certain books. A sticky note might say, read this manual more frequently, or temporarily ignore this one.
So the environment places the sticky notes.
Yes. A classic lab example is exposing pregnant mice to severe stress. When they give birth, their pups are born physically altered. They have a heightened sensitivity to cortisol, the stress hormone. The mother's traumatic environment chemically influenced how the pup's genes were expressed.
The environmental stress actively modified the biological output.
It modified the output, yes. But here is the massive caveat everyone ignores. Epigenetics cannot rewrite the books. Placing a sticky note on a manual for building a bicycle does not magically transform the text into instructions for building a rocket ship. The hardwired genetic variables provide an unalterable foundation. You can't use a sticky note to turn off a deeply entrenched polygenic trait like extreme introversion. Epigenetics tweaks the volume. It doesn't change the radio station.
It's a chemical modifier, not a foundational rewrite. That's a huge distinction. Okay, what about neuroplasticity? The popular narrative is that the brain is like a unified hard drive. You encounter trauma, you write bad code, but with enough therapy, you just delete it and write new healthy software.
Treating the brain like an erasable hard drive is a fundamental misunderstanding of neurology. The brain is actually an aggregate of thousands of highly specialized mini-computers wired together. And as the neuroscientist points out, the brain is stubbornly neuroplastic.
Stubbornly? That implies a lot of physical resistance.
It actively fights being rewired. Let's look at prosopagnosia, or face blindness. Deep in the cortex, there's a specific network of neurons whose exclusive biological purpose is recognizing human faces.
One specific job.
Right. If you have a localized stroke there, you permanently lose the ability to recognize faces. You can see your spouse. You see the nose, the eyes, the hair, but your brain physically cannot synthesize those details into an identity. It's just gone.
But the wet clay theory suggests the brain should just, tab a neighboring cluster of neurons on the shoulder and ask them to take over face duty.
Which never happens. If a 40-year-old has a stroke that destroys the motor cortex for their right arm, they will never regain full fluid use of that arm, even with decades of physical therapy. The architecture is rigid.
Right.
We do see neuroplasticity, but it's incredibly slow and metabolically expensive. Think about learning to play the guitar. It takes thousands of hours of highly repetitive, frustrating practice to forge new neural pathways. It takes years, precisely because the brain stubbornly resists altering its structure. If the brain was wet clay, you'd master the guitar over a long weekend.
So claiming that a bad parenting style easily rewires a child's brain into narcissism fundamentally ignores how rigid neural networks actually are.
Yes. It replaces biological reality with a fairy tale. If we really want to grasp the power of genetics, we have to look at the gold standard of behavioral science.
The ultimate proof. Because sickle cell and Usain Bolt are great analogies, but we need undeniable data. But how do you isolate DNA from the environment? We can't just run experiments on babies in a lab.
Ethics obviously prevent that, but nature actually ran the perfect control group for us. Behavioral geneticists rely on identical twins separated at birth.
This raises an important question, right? Because identical twins have the exact same genetic blueprint. Their microscopic libraries have the exact same books.
Exactly. Finding twins separated within days of birth and raised in totally distinct environments lets us test the environmental narrative. Imagine one twin is adopted by a wealthy, highly educated family in a bustling city. The other is adopted by a working-class family living in total isolation on a rural farm.
So wildly divergent environmental inputs. Different parents, diets, schools, stressors.
Right. If the psychological consensus is correct, if environment and trauma dictate who we become, then these two kids should develop wildly different personalities. They should match their adoptive parents.
But the data from these twin registries tells a completely different story.
It's staggering. When researchers track them down decades later and give them rigorous personality assessments, their personalities do not align with the parents who raised them. They profoundly resemble the twin they never met.
Wow.
The overlap goes way beyond basic temperament. They share incredibly specific neuroses, identical levels of baseline anxiety, matching extroversion scores, even idiosyncratic nervous tics.
That's wild.
Extensive analysis consistently demonstrates that genetics account for roughly 50 to 70% of the variance in human personality.
50 to 70%. That just shatters the narrative that biology is a background player. The DNA is writing the vast majority of the script. And honestly, considering the gene-environment loop we talked about, that remaining 30% of environment was probably selected by the genetics anyway?
Yes. Their hardwired personality pushed them to seek out environments that reinforced their biology.
Okay, accepting that 70% of our major traits are hardwired is profound. But how deep does this go? Does this biological control extend into everyday, mundane actions?
The neuroscientist in the source material pushes this to its absolute limit. He argues that every single human behavior has a genetic blueprint underlying it.
Every single behavior. That feels like a really bold overreach.
He anticipates that skepticism. He challenges the listener to find an event that feels purely random and disconnected from biology. He uses the example of getting struck by lightning.
Getting struck by lightning is a weather event. It's atmospheric pressure. Your DNA has zero influence over a lightning bolt.
The DNA doesn't control the weather, but the DNA heavily controls the physical location of the human body during the storm. Being struck requires you to be outside, exposed to the elements. That decision requires a specific tolerance for risk. Risk-taking is demonstrably hardwired. People with DNA that demands high adrenaline and blunts their perception of danger are statistically much more likely to go for a hike or play golf during a thunderstorm.
Okay, so the genetics don't summon the lightning, but they dictate the behavior that puts your body in the path of danger.
Exactly. Consider a much more mundane behavior, looking at a text message while driving.
Most people would just say that's a moral failing or a bad habit.
But that habit is built on biological mechanics. The urge to check a phone relies on your baseline capacity to sustain focus, your biological susceptibility to novel distractions, and the physical strength of your impulse control. Every single one of those functions is physically governed by the chemical wiring in your prefrontal cortex. And the schematic for that wiring was authored by your genetics.
So even the decision to glance at a screen is dictated by microscopic chemistry.
Chemistry is personality. The source material shares a devastating medical case study to prove this. A man developed an undiagnosed tumor. As a side effect, his natural testosterone production plummeted to near zero.
A catastrophic shift in his chemical landscape. What happened to his behavior?
His entire personality essentially evaporated.
Really?
Yeah, he wasn't clinically depressed, he wasn't crying or expressing despair. He just ceased to exist as the person he was. He lost interest in his favorite foods. He had zero desire to see his lifelong friends. He lost interest in hobbies, TV, intimacy. He would just sit in a chair staring blankly at the wall for hours.
The defining characteristics that made him an individual were entirely erased.
Yes. Eventually, doctors found the tumor, diagnosed the hormonal collapse, and gave him synthetic testosterone injections. The moment that single chemical was restored to his brain, his personality instantly snapped back. His humor returned, his desires returned. He became himself again.
Wow. The implications of that are massive. Because if the sudden removal of one single chemical can completely obliterate an individual's entire personality, we're forced to admit that the thousands of chemicals dictated by our genetics are actively writing the script of our daily existence.
Accepting this reality forces a profound evolution in how we view human behavior.
So what does this all mean? We have to dismantle that immediate reflex to judge people based on fabricated narratives. When we see someone struggling with empathy or displaying extreme narcissism or just engaging in destructive behaviors, our initial reaction can no longer be to play amateur detective and invent a story about how their parents ruined them.
Right. And acknowledging the role of genetics doesn't absolve people of responsibility. It doesn't excuse toxic behavior, but it replaces a cycle of blame with a much clearer, more accurate form of empathy. We start to understand that people are navigating the world constrained by biological architecture and chemical realities that we just can't see.
It pulls us out of the realm of fortune-telling and anchors us back in reality. As we wrap up this deep dive into the recipe of you, I want to leave everyone listening with a final, slightly provocative thought experiment.
Oh, I like these.
If our inherited genetics meticulously determine the physical structure of our brains. And that specific structure governs our internal chemical balance. And that chemical balance relentlessly dictates our impulses, our focus, and our choices. And those choices dictate the specific environments we actively place ourselves in.
Yeah.
To what extent is our deeply cherished concept of free will simply an incredibly convincing illusion projected by our DNA? Think about that the next time you find yourself deciding what you want to eat for dinner.
Yep.
Are you actually choosing the menu, or has the menu already chosen you?